Puoi cominciare. Grazie, Kader.
Thank you very much. And also first, I would like to thank you for today's opportunity. And I would like to thank you for allowing me to present the results of my research in Toulouse some time ago. I am grateful for the critical debate that followed, which led to my acceptance into the LECOBI research group. I also extend my thanks to the research group for providing a helpful and necessary research method. I hope to contribute data for study and critical speculation with my presentation today. My work involves analyzing the occurrences of the color black in Greek literature, treatises, and documentary papyri from 8 BC to 3 BC to understand the occurrences of the color black in biblical reference. Yeah. We need to consider the worldview of biblical time, especially since Greek was still a living language during the time of the assembly of the Septuagint and the writing of the books of the New Testament. My analysis included 751 occurrences. Don't worry, today I will only present something about the 115 occurrences in Theophrastus Historia Plantarum. The lemma melas, meaning black or dark, can be applied to various objects with different shades of darkness and color tones. Its numerous figurative uses classify it as a semanteme capable of encapsulating the values of numerous terms with more specific meanings. Black can serve as a critical case study for the usage of chromatic terms in antiquity, and Theophrastus offers ample material anchored in reality for analyzing the lexeme. Not only will the symbolic value of melas be analyzed, but the chromatic aspect and the different use to which it refers will be highlighted. Finally, the results of both the symbolic and the concrete will be put into dialogue to see how they speak to each other. Okay, so I want to begin this seminar with the Theophrastus words taken from Historia Plantarum that will provide ample material for study and speculation during today's meeting. I quote, "In considering the distinctive characteristic of plants and their nature, generally one must take into account their parts, their qualities, the way in which their life originates, and the course which it follows in each case. Now, the difference in the way in which their life originates, in their qualities, and their life history are comparatively easy to observe and are more straightforward, while those shown in their parts present more complexity. Indeed, it has not even been satisfactorily determined what ought and what ought not to be called parts, and some difficulty is involved in making the distinction. So, regarding the notion of language as a dynamic entity, I will refrain from delving into the topic now. Instead, my proposal does not concern the correlation between color terminology, mainly black and flora. Instead, my focus lies in examining the constituent elements, specifically in the case of an adjective lexeme. The greater contemplation on these components will aid in our analysis. In order to properly understand and analyze Theophrastus' life and work, it is necessary to provide a brief analysis of his methodology and written works. But before doing so, it is also essential to consider the language used in his writing and how it contributes to our understanding of the Greek worldview regarding colors, even before biblical times. This will also provide significant context for why Theophrastus and his work are meaningful case studies in interpreting ancient Greek culture. There is currently a lack of study on color terms and the color black, especially in the works of this particular author. Despite being a student of essential masters such as Plato and Aristotle, comprehensive research on his work is still lacking. Although his work contains a vast amount of information, it still needs to be systematically analyzed and valued to extract its full potential. In order to understand the meaning of certain parts, we need to delve into the Greek terminology of color. It differs significantly from what we are used to in modern times, both in terms of quality and quantity. Looking at the Homeric language as an example, we see that it tends to use ontological reference when it comes to color, using derivatives such as eues, rhodoes, phoinokes, Meanwhile, the actual terms for color are very few, and their application may seem discordant at first glance, making one question whether the sign initially belonged to the field of color. One example is the case of chloros, which Gladstone denied had any coloristic value. He argued that neither yellow nor green fit all the object to which Homer refers the adjective. This exemplified the theoretical error of introducing a necessary causal relationship between sensory perception and the sign of language. Such an approach vitiates the research method by introducing criteria that are at times aesthetical, rhetorical, physiological, ethnological, and arbitrary insofar as extra-linguistic, as noted by J. Andre. So let us briefly analyze a symptom of weak perception and sensitivity to color known as Farbenblindheit. Instead of considering it solely as a medical condition, let us examine it from a linguistic perspective and understand it as a reflection of intuition that differ from our modern understanding. The terminology used to describe this condition may not be easily understood by those who are used to modern linguistic characters, but this does not mean that it lacks its inner reason. As Weisenberg first highlighted, the terminology used to describe this condition has its own inner logic that should be appreciated. It is commonly believed that Indo-European languages tend to use words that describe the intensity of light and its variability when it comes to color, rather than the qualitative description. The roots of color terms in different languages all have a brightness value. In contrast, there is no standard term for the concept of color. Instead, it is often described in broader semantic terms such as covering, external surface, skin. See, for example, Sanskrit varna, which means cover, Latin color, Greek chroma, and crow. So, based on what we have observed regarding the function of the concrete datum in the semantic determination of the Greek adjective of color, it is therefore possible to explain what is most salient innovative characteristic, that is, the notation in the sphere of the brightness of the different nuance. This occurs because the term, in its original value, is the expression of a composite coloristic intuition, appropriately to the phenomenal aspect of color that in nature always presents itself in a particular gradation. So the ability to distinguish subtle difference in color, which may initially seem at odds very with the limited tendency to distinguish color qualitatively, is actually an aspect of archaic mentality. On the other hand, the distinction of color by abstract categories based on their particular aspects, in reality, is a construction typical of modern language that display a notable and prevalent action of the abstract cognitive need, as noted by Gipper. The Greeks, however, started from the immediate expression of a nominal datum and only gradually embarked on the abstract process. Semantic determination occurs at both ends of the fundamental meaning, whereby the original composite value unfolds into individual qualitative values. These are first expressed as a particular nuance in adherence with the concrete datum. It is worth noting that this perception of the link between the various shades of color is rooted in the original fundamental distinction between brightness level. This familiar gradation of light gives rise to the term common to two or more different tones, or the root joined to several signs, indicated different color. See, for example, in the European kel, from which in Greek kelainos, black kilos, gray, and kalainos, turquoise. So, the evolution of the color term has been influenced by an affective element that plays an essential function. This element, which is in the common motivation behind every linguistic innovation, does not come as a third factor to the two existing ones. Instead, it brings about its synthesis through those factors. For the root of a purely bright value to be determined in a qualitative sense, through reference to the concrete, it must continually re-establish a relationship with the natural world to acquire its reflection through an extra functional element of expressiveness. Moreover, if this expressive motive, in its limited and unpredictable richness, is the living source of language becoming its action on the system in a field of lexical values, will be all the more effective and recognizable. This field is linked to variable entities that depend on factors of a physical and human order, the so-called subjective qualitatives, and is exposed to infinite particular psychological attitudes. So, in the process of formation of semantic value of the Greek terms of color, it's possible to find always documented or centrally presupposed by documentation these two factors. When the relationship with the natural world is realized through the constant reference of the adjective to a given object, the language creates in itself those attitudes of style, which are semantic reflexes and stable links according to Pagliaro. This link must be taken into account when one wishes to discern what is proper to the author style from what is of the linguistic system. It is not possible to disregard such attitudes by relegating them to stilistics, since they act precisely within the system by giving a well-defined and peculiar content to words and structures. The practical values of color are thus anchored in the language, which make it indispensable to recognize through literary documentation the subjective circumstances that have been translated into facts of speech that are particularly significant for the history of individual lexical sign. So, most of what we know about Theophrastus' life come from Diogenes and Laertius' Lives of the Philosophers, which were compiled at least 400 years after Theophrastus' death. Therefore, the accuracy of Diogenes' record is not in question. Born in 370 before Christ at Tereus in Lesbos, he moved to Athens at a young age, where he became a student of Plato. Under Plato's tutelage, he first learned the importance of the principle of classification, which is present throughout his extant work and is often considered a hallmark of his second teacher, Aristotle. Nevertheless, classification played a significant role in Plato's later speculation, as he believed that by grouping things into their natural kinds, humans could gain insight into the ideal form that these kinds represent and which constitute the world of reality, according to his later metaphysical teachings. It is unclear whether Theophrastus derived his classification principle from Plato or Aristotle, but he was the first to apply it systematically to the study of plants. In his botanical works, he constantly asked questions related to the subject matter, like what is the difference, what is essential nature. These questions are very similar to those we ask ourselves when we approach Greek lexemes related to colors. Theophrastus was only 15 years younger than Aristotle. After Plato's death, Theophrastus became Aristotle's student, but the age difference was insignificant. They were on practically equal terms, and Aristotle was deeply attached to his friend. After Aristotle died at the age of 63, he left his book to his favorite student, along with the autographs of his work and his garden on the ground of Lyceum. The garden became of particular interest to Theophrastus, the first systematic botanist who made observation recorded in his botanical works. Diogenes preserved Aristotle's will, which included a provision for the maintenance of the garden. So, according to Diogenes, Theophrastus lived to the age of 85. He had a rich and fascinating life, marked by a personal friendship with both Plato and Aristotle, and having witnessed the entire career of Philip and Alexander of Macedon. Alexander, another pupil of Aristotle, had taken scientifically trained observer with him to the east, and their observations were at Theophrastus' disposal. This is why his description of plants are more comprehensive than the flora of Greece and Levant. His account of plants such as the cotton plant, pepper, cinnamon, myrrh, were derived from the reports of Alexander's followers. The search of his description of plants outside of Greece and the Levant has been of some subject of some controversy. In an able tract, Kirchner disputes an argument that the observation of Sprengel, even of the Greek flora, were made later. During Theophrastus' time, the peripatetic school was a vital educational institution with 2,000 pupils, according to Diogenes. Alexander, due to his connection with Aristotle, was interested in it, and we are informed that Demetrius supported it financially at a later time. So it is possible that some students were appropriately employed in collecting fact and observation. Theophrastus, like his master, was a very voluminous writer. Diogenes gave a list of 227 tratrices from his pen, covering most of the topic of human interest. The principal works still extant are the 9 book of the Enquiry into Plants, Historia Plantarum, and the 6 book on the causes of plants. These are complete. The style of this work, as of the botanical book, suggests that, as in the case of Aristotle, what we possess consists of notes for lectures or notes taken off lecture. There is no literary charm. The sentences are most compressed and highly elliptical, to the point sometimes of obscurity. Translation, as with Aristotle, must be paraphrased. So, now it's evident that this serves as a prime example of a scholarly case study, since all the linguistic elements are present and must be integrated into his work. Language has inherent symbolism that can be observed both directly and indirectly. When writing, even though it's mediated, is still for an internal context and thus encoded equally to the linguistic function and context. By studying ancient Greek language and its use about other culture, we can gain a worldview that includes not only objective characteristics, but also subjective qualities that show themselves in the encoded interpretation. It also provides an assumed accessibility of ours to its language, given the concrete reference. So, let us begin by examining the occurrences of melas and testing the proposed methodology. We aim to determine if the usage of melas takes into account concrete color values that differ from blackness, symbolic values, or both. The following parameters will be used to analyze the occurrences. 1. Expression of the chromaticism and relative brightness. 2. Reference to a concrete entity. 3. Affective elements and its degree of variation. We will start with the simple case of trees. In addition to the reference to woods, we find a reference to 5 specific trees. As a result, we can conclude that melas can refer to a gradation of brown related to the trunks or gradation of green related to the foliage, and the reference to a concrete entity is the trees and relative gradation of trunks or foliage. But we need to examine the affective element and how much it varies to argue that these chromaticisms are related to the term. So, if we consider a high degree of affective element, we may think of the cult of the tree. Many examples from Greek religion come to mind, such as the little herms depicted among the branches of a tree in the shrine of Katosmine in Crete, the epithet inhabitant of the oak tree attributed to the Zeus of Dodona or Thessaly, or the Artemis of Ephesus presented by Callimachus. Pliny, Virgilius, Luciano, they state that, following simple ancient rituals, certain places in the country dedicated a tree of exceptional size to the god and recommend that forests are more valuable than statues or gold or ivory. Pliny noticed that the trees are perpetually dedicated to deities, such as the oak to Jupiter, the laurel to Apollo, the myrtle to Venus, and the poplar to Heracles. Despite this paradigmatic assignation, those who study the flora of the Greek soon notice that almost no plant, tree, flower, bushes, fruit, is the exclusive monopoly of a deity. It is rightly noted that this attribution, while functioning as a heraldic blazon that is easily recognizable by all, are far from unambiguous and exclusive. Moreover, a deity might have several plants under its protection for reasons that are now clear, less so, or even in some cases enigmatic. By changing deities, the meaning of a plant changed, and it is, therefore, a detailed process to search for an ambiguous symbolism that is valid in all cases. So, regarding the use of the word melans concerning trees, it's unlikely to have a direct mythological or divine counterpart. Instead, it may refer to the visual perception of darkness, as the tree in question have leafy crowns and trunks with wide roughness, which produce many shadows. This interpretation is supported by the fact that the woods, which are also dense and shadowy, are often associated with the same word. Therefore, it seems that when the word melas is used in conjunction with trees, it refers more to the darkness of the foliage and the trunk, rather than to any specific shade of brown or green. Also in the domain of trees, we find two other occurrences. The occurrence of gall about tree sap is reported to us 3 times with an explicit ag-affective element like black bile. It is therefore useless to analyze its possible chromaticism. However, it allows us to address a significant issue for this study, to analyze and be able to read many affective elements relating to the semantic field of the natural world. Metaphor is not simply a matter of language, says Lakoff and Johnson. In Greek culture, metaphors were commonly used to represent and conceptualize the world. It is essential to consider how idioms can reflect different ways of thinking, and in our case, a concrete reference is necessary to explain the fluid that flow inside the logs used to support them. The model of plants was often used as a metaphor for human in Greek culture. Plants were used to represent and explain concepts such as filiation, marriage, individual development, and political belonging to a territory. For example, plants were often described using anthropomorphic terms like kephale for head and kome for foliage. Conversely, humans were often described using plant-related terms, such as the embryo branching out like a tree, hairs taking root and sprouting like plants, and the flowering of age. So, Mandart offers a concise reflection on this, albeit in a critical framework with necessary updates. I quote, inextricably linked to the tree that is body, a body it cannot live, the soul thus becomes the object of a cult and receives sacrifice. The tree's body is then imagined as a similar to that of man. For example, if it's wounded, it bleeds, end quote. So, to explain this gall, Theophrastus employs the cultural metaphor primarily referring to the black bile. To deepening its meaning, we must look at the 13.1 Aristotelian problem, which is the most comprehensive and organized analysis of the phenomenon of melancholy in the Aristotelian corpus. Although there are serious doubts if this text, as it survived today, was written by Aristotle or one of his followers, perhaps Theophrastus, nevertheless, it is widely accepted that it reflects the authentic ideas of Aristotle. The two counterbalancing sentiments, mirthfulness and moroseness, attributed in the text to the melancholic person, introduce the primary difficulty in understanding the unclear notion of melancholy in this work. All the previous approaches understood this sentiment as diversity in the symptomatology of melancholy, which is an ancient mental disorder that is similar to modern depression. However, from my point of view, this text is a study of pathological psychology, underlying the significant role of black bile as the causative factor of the two above emotions in humans under the specific influence of temperature. Humors overrating had as a result the mirthfulness and its overcooling moroseness. The reference to healthy people and the gradation of the quantity of black bile in the human body as little, middle, and massive, which is associated with mentally ill person, indicate that these two emotions were not only recognized as a pathological manifestation of patient, but also a temperamental characteristic of healthy people, which arise from the same alteration of this humor when its quantity is limited. Examining deeper the psychopathological aspect of this content, We may assume that, due to the fact mirthfulness was presented in the form of excessive enthusiasm, passion, and courage, and on the other hand, morosity by the distinctive elements of irrational fear, indolence, and absurdity. The first one referred to mania and the second to melancholy, since their description correspond to the basic feature of each disease. Therefore, under the new reading, black bile should be perceived as the common source of the above two mental disorders, expressing the Aristotelian version of their correlation, which preoccupied many of the ancient Greek physicians as Themiston and his follower Rufus of Ephesus, Galen, and Artaeus. So, moving on, in winter, the elm tree's buds are easily visible. They are egg-shaped and brown, protruding for each species. The cultural metaphor of both melas and buds, themselves linked to fertility, as we shall see later, especially for fruits and seed, can also be quite powerful. However, the visual perception of this bud, which enables the plant to survive the winter, remains clear. This means that the tree's expression of color and relative brightness is typically dark brown. As we observe seeds and fruit, we can see that dark violet color has a minimal affective impact as a visual perception in grapes and figs. The same seed varieties also exhibit a luministic value that ranges from dark violet to almost black. We must note the name deadly nightshade among them, which has a related symbolic meaning we would expect. The only expectation to our analysis so far is the water lily fruit, which suggests that the dark brown belongs to the semantic value of melas. However, we must recognize a high effective element. Our focus should be on explaining the invisible aspect with the visible one. In the natural sphere, the cultural metaphor reminds that of the human body. The adjective melas is frequently used to describe internal fluids, and Theophrastus attributed it to the color itself as an expression of fertility or of greater fertility. Therefore, it's not surprising to find this adjective used in reference to seed, and we should not dismiss this data. Let's us now turn to bashes, again maintaining the proposed methodology. We are not surprised by the juxtaposition of the term melas plants that present a dense reproduction and thus a consequent presence of shade and overshadowing to visual perception. Thus, the discourse about tree foliage and the brightness value of dark applies to neuron, thyme, majoral, and myrtle. In this botanical field, on the other hand, we must recognize two brightness values that deviate from our black, as there is certainly no affective element other than visual perception in the occurrences of rush, dark brown, and black ivy, dark purplish red. A different and somehow broader discussion must be made for maidenhair. So the first is expression of chromaticism and relative brightness green, in reference to a concrete entity shrub. The affective element and its degree of variation might be variable, but in any case, affects the attribution of brightness value green to the semantic field of the lemma melas. In fact, there might be a threefold actual element. 1. The shade due to conspicuous foliage. 2. The psychological attribution of the name as in opposition to white maidenhair, and 2. Explicit attribution for classification and recognition, not as an intrinsic characteristic of the plant. 3. The talking name carries a symbolism emphasized by Theophrastus himself as a plant beneficial for the hair. Several studies emphasize and define healthy hair as melas, hence the name of the plant. The offerings of hair in Greek word are expressed by the use of a lexicon referring to trephine or hauxine, suggesting not only the idea of the plant model of hair, but also the plant model of the growth and nourishment of the young. One thinks of cutting off the hair in Athens during the Choreoutes, when the Paides sacrificed the hair to Artemis, or during the Apaturia, the feast of the introduction of the child into the fraternities. In any case, the affective element undermines the attribution of the green brightness value to the semantic field of the melas lemma. Let's now turn on flowers. 5 main occurrences of the term melas juxtaposed with them. We will not dwell on the occurrences of coercion as a root because of the speech made earlier. We can state the other occurrences in their entirety. The expression of chromaticism and relative brightness is a gradation of purple. The reference to a concrete entity are flower petals, and the affective element in its degree of variation is low. The consistency of chromaticism, even its relative brightness, forces us to consider the affective element as only visual perception. We do not have color variation as with foliage or trunks. In this case, we have color coherence. We must therefore accept melas as referring to a gradation of purple. This does not mean there is no highly effective element as an expression of coded symbolism. However, this does not invalidate the compactness of coloring. As for the high affective element, note the speaking name of birthwort. I will not dwell on the apparent function and symbolism of this flower. I do, however, want to highlight how melas in this case refers not to a mournful or tragic event as we are accustomed to think, but to birth, which, although linked to it in the Greek mentality, does not univocally represent an adverse event. Such a study can and should suggest the necessary rethinking of specific interpretative categories. Birth and its meaning have been mentioned before. Note also the occurrences with Elbor. On this, I would like to conclude our analysis of the occurrences of melas in the Historia Plantarum. We have an expression of chromaticism and relative brightness violet, a reference to a concrete entity, flower petal, an affective element and its degree of variation, visual perception. It is also true that the proposed methodology works even with a high effective element. Indeed, it shows how the same, if analyzed and used with scientific rigor, can and must return value of indisputable usefulness about a linguistic and therefore cultural worldview. This is the most knowledgeable version of his myth, attested since Homer's Odyssey, during a digression concerning the lineage of Theoclymenus, a prophet sprung from Melampus line of seer, in which a sketch about the epic narrative concerning Melampus finds its place. A sketch with such brevity that its detail must have been familiar to Homer's audience. The daughters of Proteus were seized with maniac madness because they despised the worship of Dionysus. They believed themselves to be cows and wandered in the wilderness, moaning abominable in sight with bald head and skin turned white and covered with purulent wounds. Their insanity manifested mainly as hypersexuality in the form of sexual attack on male shepherd in the woods. Melampus promised to cure the woman if the king gave him 1/3 of his kingdom. Proteus refused the proposal, but when the madness continues and spreads to other women of Argo, Proteus called Melampus back. However, the seer demanded 2/3 of the kingdom, one for himself and the other for his brother Bias. The king felt he had no choice but to agree. So Melampus chased the insane woman through the woods, trapped them in a cave deep inside the mountains of Arcadia, and healed them of their madness with sacred baths and the use of a herb called Elborus niger. Leucippe died during the chase, but the two other women were brought back to Argos, cured, and were married to Melampus and Bias, who ruled the kingdom of Argos after death. I emphasize in the slide all the affective elements that can come together in a single flower and, through the brightness value, merge into it. These affective values are present today are recurred through the use of melas black in Greek literature, treatises, and documentary papyri from 8 BC to 3rd BC. Once again, I will also underline the invitation not to overestimate the data. In fact, this flower that seem so miraculous as other occurrences in the Greek world. In the 6th century before Christ, the first sacred war between the Delphic Amphictyony and the city of Syra is known because the league poisoned the water supply of the city of Syra by using hellebore. The hellebore-added water soon made the defenders so weak from diarrhea that they were unable to continue to withstand the assault. Syra was conquered and the entire population was slaughtered. I want to conclude now thanking you for your enormous patience by summarizing what we have seen and leaving some suggestions for a working perspective. First of all, melas can and should be referred to as far as the brightness value alone is concerned, in addition to black or dark, reported by the major vocabularies, to the purple scale and the brown scale. Further, melas concerning the affective element, in addition to the canonical negative values, also emphasized by various studies, can indicate fertility and birth images. Third, the affective element, mainly if it uses the disposition of the cultural metaphor, is an element that is still analyzed little or poorly in the critical sphere. Sometimes it is discarded in the name of an impossible attainment of the general and abused. I hope to have shown how, if properly and knowledgeably analyzed, it can present glimpses, in our case, of another and not primitive archaic culture, in the knowledge that only through the recognition of the otherness, the attribution to it of its specificity, can we also understand ourselves. The practical values of color are thus anchored in the language, which make it indispensable to recognize through literary documentation the subjective circumstances that have been translated into fact of speech, that are particularly significant for the history of individual lexical sign. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we can thank you for all the presentation, the introductory part, because you explained well your how you have organized or have used the methodology. And this idea of the affective element is also interesting. That is true that we have to have in mind. And also all the differences or the broad chromatic spectrum of melas and this idea of brightness. Perhaps I think that Marina has some question that you can use the Italian or the English, or don't you have?
Prima di tutto grazie mille per la tua conferenza, mi sembra molto utile per il mio studio di Oscurus. Mi è piaciuto moltissimo prendere in considerazione non soltanto il tono, non so come si dice, tono, colore, con la luce oppure il valore associato al colore e alla luminosità. Ad esempio, nel caso di Oscurus, non so se melas, non lo so, può significare società, ad esempio suciedad, o morte, non so. Nel caso de las flores, muerte, es que no sé cómo se dice en español, en italiano, ajadas, flores ajadas, o sea, flores Lourdes, mustias, sì.
Okay.
Quando le fiore stanno per morire, quando sparisce la fiore, la brillantezza o la maturità, non so come si dice in italiano.
Allora, innanzitutto grazie a voi appunto per l'ascolto, mi rendo conto che fosse molto densa, però mi sembrava necessaria la parte anche metodologica. Ho trovato anche molti dati per quanto riguarda quest'ultima tua annotazione. Appunto, il nero fondamentalmente in natura, come lo concepiamo noi, fondamentalmente non esiste. Appunto, sono più quelle occorrenze che abbiamo visto di un viola, colori scuri, nello specifico
Vale.
viola o un marrone molto scuro, però in pochi casi. Il nero invece viene riferito più volte da Teofrasto stesso al decadimento, quello che dicevi tu, appunto al passaggio di stato della pianta, del fiore o del cespuglio, appunto è più relativo alla morte, alla mancanza di fertilità, quello sì.
Mhm.
E appunto l'invito,
Sì.
soprattutto visto quello che mi hai detto di cui ti occupi, penso di aver capito, appunto quello su cui ho voluto sottolineare molto è il fattore soggettivo che tante volte, soprattutto in letteratura, viene scartato come simbologia, in realtà ci permette di conoscere meglio il dato testuale, soprattutto a fronte di non concepire la Grecia come Grecia nella sua interezza, ma al suo tempo sarebbe meglio parlare di isole di grecità, proprio
Mhm.
per le diverse letture, culture e organizzazioni.
Mhm. Sì, no, è molto importante quindi il contesto, perché ricordo l'articolo di Lourdes, ad esempio dell'eclipse. Eh, il parallelismo, nel caso di poesia, il parallelismo può mettere in luce il valore. Sì, non so se mi spiego bene. Mi
Sì,
dispiace
sì.
per il mio italiano, devo imparare un po', ho dimenticato molte
Scusate per
parole.
il mio non spagnolo, scusate me, anzi.
Eh, Però questa cosa interessante che questa idea che appare in Teofrastro è quello che troviamo dopo in De Coloribus, quando lui fa il studio delle piante proprio, lui dice che la pianta dopo essere floros può diventare melas, no? Lo dice chiaramente perché per la umidità, per il passo del tempo, per diversi fattori che infatti si vede di nuovo che il colore mostra lo stato della pianta.
Sì. Ha qualche occorrenza specifica sul maschile della pianta, ad esempio per Sicilian Beet, la costa, non so come se conoscete in spagnolo, una verdura. Per la varietà appunto maschile e femminile delle piante viene usato poco, però sì, è più legato allo stato di decadimento della pianta. O come ho mostrato ad esempio nelle gemme,
Sì.
appunto il passaggio di stato durante l'inverno, la stasi della pianta, l'immobilità della pianta, è più appunto su questo, nero, melas come nero.
Mm.
Ehm,
Sì, no, dimmi.
No, in questi, non lo so, in Teofrasto, immagino di sì. Hai trovato, vabbè, antonimi, sì, antonimi nel caso di melas è quando si usa con un valore di, ai con i valori che hai, detto, simbolici, sì. Gli antonimi, non so se hai trovato antonimi di melas nei casi. Ad esempio, questa fiore è melas
Sì.
e poi un altro fiore antitetica. Non so se mi sto spiegando bene.
Sì, sì, no, ho capito e grazie anzi per la domanda. E poi anche per la conoscenza dell'italiano antonimi non è così immediato conoscerlo, ho capito. Vorrei
Lo so, sì.
sapere appena io lo
Sì.
spagnolo così. No, sì, ho trovato su questo non ci sono molte novità, nel senso è quello che ci aspettiamo bianco-nero, come ho citato qualcosa durante la presentazione o come vi accennavo prima, maschile e femminile viene sempre paragonato in questo uno dei pochi casi in cui non c'è il parallelismo tra gli opposti bianco e nero è per l'uva, dove appare stranamente un discorso sull'uva anche gialla.
Già.
Vero.
Quello. Però fondamentalmente è sempre bianco-nero.
Bianco.
E poi questo comunque si scontra per quanto riguarda questo bacino di informazioni, Teofrasto nella sua categorizzazione più tra le specie in sé delle piante, si basa tra specie di piante e le spiega alla luce del mondo animale. Quindi magari appunto manca quel di sicuro, magari c'erano anche altri dati che però lui non riporta appunto, non essendo nel suo ragionamento del trattato.
Mhm.
E una cosa che
Grazie mille.
per me è
Figurati.
sorpresa è quella idea di che non è presente il rosso, no? Molto. Cioè, soprattutto melas è un viola, un purpura o un marrone, però il rosso
Rosso no.
non si trova. Un rosso scuro, per esempio,
Non si trova il rosso scuro, si possono trovare appunto le gradazioni di viola, in realtà anche molto chiare in alcuni casi, contro il discorso di pensare che sia sempre il colore scuro, però il rosso no, il rosso viene tolto. Sì,
Pero es sorprendente porque a la fine, no, no per il rosa, però per il purpura, perché loro hanno l'aggettivo per esprimere
sì,
il purpura, invece nelle piante usa velas proprio, no? Che
sì,
come
sì, sì.
che per noi è impossibile di penseremo che sia un viola scuro, invece con quello che tu hai mostrato tu è
Sì,
viola
sì.
puro, per così dire.
E soprattutto poi nel discorso in cui accennava all'inizio circa sia l'ambiente del testo nato da lezioni, appunti di lezioni, ma soprattutto nello spiegare piante non conosciute alla grecità,
Sì,
il discorso che avevo fatto all'inizio, maggiormente stranisce perché appunto uno si aspetterebbe, se devo spiegare bene una pianta che non si conosce che è rossa, utilizzo i termini legati.
certo.
Invece no, viene usato melas proprio perché appunto sembra non essere utilizzato tutto con la gradazione dei rossi.
O forse anche diventa, non so si può pensare, perché tu hai controllato l'opera, però forse può diventare come un termine tecnico in teoparastro, nel senso, no, perché è quello che tu dici, no? Sì, alla fine il libro è stato scritto per fare conoscere quello che non si conosce. No? È sorprendente che in effetti lui non usi altri termini di colori che lui conosce e che la gente riconosce come tali.
Sì, sì,
Allora, non so fino a che punto si può considerare come non so, un aggettivo che almeno nel corpus, in questo corpus è scritto come un termine tecnico, no? Che si usa per un tipo di pianta che ha pues, questa varietà di tonalità purpura, no? Non perché realmente, almeno per noi, no?
sì.
Risulta sorprendente.
Sì, questa credo sia un'ottima prospettiva di lavoro, naturalmente ancora non l'ho affrontata, ho notato anch'io questo discorso tecnico e secondo me vale la pena approfondirlo molto. Ripeto, comunque a fronte c'è un discorso proprio tecnico di osservazione negli intenti e nell'opera e come dicevo prima alla dottoressa Marina, non è che questo non ci sia nella letteratura, però è più facile argomentare a favore o contro questo aspetto. In questo caso un discorso tecnico penso si possa fare e quindi sarebbe bello analizzarlo, quello sì.
Sì, perché...
Ho una domanda, mi dispiace
No,
soltanto
vai.
una.
Anzi,
Sì,
grazie.
indipendentemente dal colore delle piante, quando gli alberi sono in ombra, Teofrastro usa melas, ¿no?
Sì,
¿Ves? Lourdes, lo de
Como
la
el-
sombra,
Come il
la
scuro,
manzana. Chiaro.
sì,
che la sombra è nera per loro, non è mancanza
Sì.
di luce, no?
sì,
Sino
sì,
si capisce come una cosa di un
Ok.
colore, no? È
Sì.
sorprendente perché no? È un fatto originato per la presenza o assenza di luce e alla fine si percepisce come una cosa cromatica, veramente. Sì.
Sì,
E si vede anche in latino.
sì,
sì, ad esempio le grotte
sì,
sono nere, ma non sono nere, non hanno luce, ma nell'antichità sono nere,
sì,
le grutte, ad
sì.
esempio.
Sì, poi
Allora,
anche lì c'è poi il discorso tecnico, in quel caso dei versi formulari, appunto, poi le grotte prendono l'epiteto di nero, però sì,
sì.
appunto.
Sì, certo, un po' abbiamo questa la questione stilistica, no? Che dal punto di vista metrico funziona, non va
sì,
bene usarlo. E quello che per me è stato molto sorprendente è quell'idea della brillantezza, no? Della luminosità,
sì,
perché no? Uno pensa nel nero e sempre pensa giusto nella
oscurità.
sì, la mancanza di luce, no?
sì,
Alla fine invece è il Niger, no? Latino, questo Marina.
Sì, Niger di fronte a Ater. Niger sarebbe nero con luce, Ater no, sarebbe altro Niger. Non so se no.
No,
Mi
abbiamo
ora
perso,
sì, ora
Ah,
sì.
ti abbiamo perso
ok.
Marina.
Sì, no, dicevo che Niger è in latino è un nero con luminosità, di fronte a Ater, che è un nero senza luce. Nell'antichità la luce, la luminosità è molto importante, più importante nella società attuale.
Sì, era quello che cercavo di dire sul valore dei colori che non sono impostati secondo i nostri parametri, ma è proprio a livello linguistico. Noi abbiamo la luminosità dentro le radici dei termini legati ai colori. Quindi appunto poi non sorprende che si arrivi appunto a un discorso di luminosità anche sul melas. Poi lo sviluppo pian piano fa trasparire meno questo fattore. Però come detto tu appunto anche sulle due diverse ATEAS e l'altra, penso sia...
Sì, sì. Allora, non so se c'è qualche commento o domanda in più. Allora, se non c'è nessuna domanda in più, possiamo concludere. Quest'anno chiudiamo così i seminari. Caderi Marina ci vedremo nell'IBS, Marina online, però Cadera ci vediamo lì proprio. Marina ti perdi quello meglio che dopo il congresso.
Sì, certo. Mi piacerebbe andare lì e vederci, perché non ti conosco in persona. Spero di poter vederti in un altro momento. E sì, mi perdo il viaggio e poi dopo il congresso, che è molto felice. Non so come si dice. Io uso parole, ma
Ripeto, vorrei
Però
saperle usare anch'io così in spagnolo. Neanche ci
sì,
provo, quindi
uso
neanche ci provo.
una parola in spagnolo e Sì. Ah, no,
Eh,
uso una parola in spagnolo e poi inserisco i. Mm.
Funziona,
I,
funziona.
funziona, sì, penso di sì.
forse viene a giugno, Cadere, allora
Ah,
così possiamo trovarci in persona,
ah,
che si lavora diverso. Sì, perché pensava di venire adesso, però come abbiamo tanta cosa nel CEU, le ho detto che forse è meglio a giugno, che siamo più liberi e speriamo bene, no? Cioè, stare più liberi alla fine di giugno. Allora, grazie a tutti e ci vediamo. Gracias, Sara, por participar, don Juan Luis, que no le vemos, pero confiamos que está allí. Silvano, que se ha conectado, pero ha debido de salir. Y nada, que muchas gracias por todo. Y,
muchas gracias.
y nos vemos, bueno, nos escuchamos en Sofía. ¿Vale?
Está bien. Pues muchas gracias, grazie mille.
Grazie grande a voi.
Y nada, y un abrazo.
Gracias.
Grazie a
Gracias,
tutti,
Cadere.
davvero.
Sì.
Grazie a lei. Salve.
Grazie.
Ciao.
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 Ciao.